Hi folks, we're going to take a look at number 10 on the Unit 5 assignment. So they're asking us to solve this equation on 0 to 2 pi. So here our goal again is to isolate a trig ratio equaling some number. And we can do that fairly easily here because I can solve using opposite operations. All right, so let's take the 3 to the other side. So tan squared 2x is equal to 3. And then I'll just take the square root of both sides. And remember that I have to consider that both the positive and negative square root of 3 is going to solve the equation. Sorry, I should have gotten rid of the square there. So we end up with tan 2x equaling plus or minus root 3. And hopefully you recognize root 3 as being a tan ratio which corresponds to special angles. All right, so let's start with tan 2x equaling positive root 3. So I'll do this in 2 stages. So remember that tan is y over x, so that means that the it's going to be the either pi over 3 or pi over 6 triangle, but it's going to be the one where the y value is larger. So that's going to be the pi over 3 triangle. So 1, 2, root 3, hence y over x, tangent value of root 3. All right, so that means that 2x is equal to pi over 3. Now remember, when we're working with tangent, we only need to take one base answer. So we've determined our value for 2x, and so next I can just divide by 2 and get pi over 6 as our starting value. And then from there, we're just going to add multiples of the period of this trig expression. So remember that tangent has a period of pi, and so if we're working with tan 2x, the period is just going to be equal to pi over 2. So we're just going to be adding multiples of pi over 2. Okay, but of course, I'm not going to think of it as adding multiples of pi over 2. I'm going to think of it as adding multiples of 3 pi over 6 so that I've got the corresponding denominator. All right, so next I also can work with tan of 2x equaling negative root 3. So again, I'm going to be working with the same related acute angle as I was working with in the previous one, except now I'm going to be in the second quadrant. So again, like I said, same related acute angle. So instead of being pi over 3, it's going to be 2 pi over 3. All right, and again, our period is still pi over 2. So here, 2x is equal to 2 pi over 3, and x is equal to, divided by 2 is 2 pi over 6, and of course 2 pi over 6 is just pi over 3. So it's going to be pi over 3 plus multiples of the period. All right, but again, I'm not going to think of this as pi over 3 plus multiples of pi over 2. I'll think of it as, well, pi over 3 is the same as 2 pi over 6 plus multiples of 3 pi over 6. All right, just so that the denominators are consistent. All right, so now we can start listing our answers. So let's start with this one here. So we're only going from 0 to 2 pi. So we don't have to go into the negatives at all. So here we have pi over 6. Here we have pi over 6 plus 3 pi over 6 is 4 pi over 6, which of course is 2 pi over 3. All right, and if we add 4 pi over 6 plus another 3 pi over 6, we're going to end up with 7 pi over 6. All right, and then 7 plus another 3 is going to be 10 pi over 6, which can be reduced to 5 pi over 3. But if I add another 3 here, 13 pi over 6, that's too big because that's bigger than pi. So my answers that I get here are pi over 6, 2 pi over 3, 7 pi over 6, and 5 pi over 3. All right. So now let's start listing our answers from the second branch when it's equal to negative root 3. So again, we've got pi over 3. Okay, then we have, again, instead of pi over 3, I'll think of it as 2 pi over 6 plus 3 pi over 6. So that gives me 5 pi over 6. Okay, let's add another 3 there. So that's going to give me 8 pi over 6. And 8 pi over 6, excuse me, is just 4 pi over 3. And then 8 plus another 3 is going to be 11 pi over 6. And we're not going to go any further because if I add another 3 to this, 14 pi over 6 is too big. So the answers that I get here are pi over 3, 5 pi over 6, 4 pi over 3, and 11 pi over 6. So 8 answers in all. All right, so let's recap here. Step number 1 was to isolate my trig ratio, remembering that when I take the square root of both sides, I have to consider both the positive and negative square root. And from there, I recognize both these possible scenarios involved special angles. In one case, it was my pi over 3 triangle, and the other one, my 2 pi over 3 special angle. All right, and then from there, I solved for x and used my period to determine all the subsequent answers. All right, that's it for this one.